himself. So he says to his brothers, come to me. And the Rashi says, what was the purpose for him coming close? Because he said, my brothers are embarrassed. So he called to them, please come to me. They showed him he had a bris mila. What in the world is accomplished by showing there's a bris mila? As if they didn't believe it was Yosef, and how is that going to make them less embarrassed?
Yeah, so the question is, Yosef showed them they had a bris mila, and the question would be, how would that show? What would it add to the fact that he already said he's Yosef? So if the pshat would be they didn't believe him, they thought he was lying, so the bris mila might prove he was of Jewish origin. But why would they assume that he's lying? Why would the Mishnah Lamelech make up a story that he was Yosef? And the other thing is that the bris mila itself might cause embarrassment. So in terms of the first issue, the issue is this. I don't think he showed them the bris mila to prove that he was Yosef. Mistama, if he said he was Yosef, there's no reason to assume that he's not Yosef. But the big fear they have is, now that he's Yosef, what's he going to do to them? He's going to kill them, going to torture them, going to take vengeance against them. So apparently the bris mila is the following. The bris mila is a covenant. But it's not only a covenant between you and God, which of course it is, it's also a covenant among all Jews. All Jews share this covenant of bris. So by Yosef reminding them, they would know he has bris, but he's showing them that you and I share a covenant. And because we share a covenant, I'm not going to harm you. That's what it was. In terms of whether it would embarrass the brothers or not, that's a separate matter. But Yosef didn't want to embarrass them barabim. He didn't want them to be embarrassed in front of all the Egyptians. In terms of privately, if he needed to communicate the idea that because we have a covenant, I'm not going to harm you, so if that took a little embarrassment, so be it. That was necessary for the larger picture. Now, I thought you were going to ask another kasha. It actually says earlier, Rashi brings, that Yosef made all the Egyptians circumcised. So if that's so, if every Egyptian had a bris, so Yosef showing a bris, Bichlal wouldn't prove anything. Yeah, that's another question. But there, number one, who says that the brothers knew that Egyptians were circumcised? That could be they didn't know. The other thing is that the fact that the Egyptians circumcised, that might have meant they're making a covenant of loyalty to Yosef. And if that's what it means, Yosef would have no reason to be circumcised. But by Yosef being circumcised, that shows that it's because he's a Jew, right? So the circumcision of Mitzrayim wouldn't be Moshiach. Yeah.
This is Ascendant. Can the Rav explain or address the Torah's perspective on open AI/artificial intelligence? Perhaps how it relates to or changes our perspective on Bechira?
Yeah, this is a very, very difficult question, very complicated question. In fact, the newest development, I don't know what the name of the site is, but some company did something in artificial intelligence where you simply, even by your voice, you simply throw them out a question and they go through the entire internet and they make judgments, what's valid, what's not valid, and an essay is written in front of your eyes. It's not a search engine. It is not simply an engine that brings some existing document. Mm-hmm. It creates a document. I was really flabbergasted. In a way, it kind of demoralized me. It's like, gee, why come to work here? They don't need me. All right, there were some questions it couldn't answer. It simply was too much. But one question, what's the difference between Rabbi Salanter and the Ramchal? And this thing starts typing out. You see in your eyes, it's typing out an essay. Okay, good. It wasn't the deepest essay. Okay, Eino Chinami. But it gave you a decent answer, a readable answer that made sense. But then somebody told me they were testing it, that they asked the question, what's the difference between Or Sameach and Esha Torah's approach to Kiruv? And it said, insufficient information. So it wasn't able to answer everything. So I guess we're still needed for those Q&As, although I probably wouldn't answer either. But okay. All right. But be it as it may, the questioner is 100% correct. Number one, on one hand, these technologies are absolutely amazing. And in many, many ways, it could help a person in Torah learning and the like. On the other hand, it's very, very challenging because it makes us have to rethink what is special about a human being. What is special about a human mind? We say that we are B'Tselem Elokim, we're in the image of God, We have a neshama that is a chelek Elokah. It's actually part of God, whatever that means exactly, because unlike everything else that God created by his speech, God created cows by his dibor, we were created by God's own breath. God's breath, kaviyachal, entered into us. And if you look in the Rishonim, most of the Rishonim define the nature of the godly soul of the human being in terms of their intellect, their reasoning, their capacity to make choices, their ability to think conceptually, abstract formulation of ideas. Certainly that's how the Rambam describes it. And yet we now have machines that kind of go through the same process. So the question is, what am I? How am I different? Now, this has been an old theme of science fiction for at least 50 years, before there even was an internet and widespread use of computers. This goes all the way back to these science fiction writers who were thinking about this and the like, and it really throws us for a loop. I don't know, we're going to have to figure this out. Obviously, people are going to say, well, the machine or the AI is still not capable of conceptualism. It's only simply retrieving existing information out there, and it's not able to be mavin davar mitoch davar, meaning it can take a source from here and a source from here and a source from here and put them together, but it will not be able to make interpretive leaps. That is the uniqueness of human intelligence. But I can say that, but I'm just not so sure if that is the case. If you see what these things can do, and of course there'll be further developments down the road. So the question becomes, what is the X factor of the neshama? Now, in some ways, we faced this problem at a much earlier part in history. People debated the nature of the golem, right? The golem is this artificial human, that is humanoid, that is made by the formulas of Sefer Yetzirah. Legend has it, although many people say it's not true, that the Maharal of Prague made a golem to protect the Jewish people like a Superman, and he decommissioned the golem, and in the attic of the Maharal's shul in Prague, a locked attic, there's still the golem there, and people tell you stories about the Nazis broke the lock, and they went in and they woke the golem up, and they got destroyed. Who knows? As they say, the attic is locked, and they don't let anybody in there, and the like. But the nature of the golem is still the same thing. The golem can do everything a human being can do except talk. It can't talk, so that they say it doesn't have that koyach hadibor. And the question is a golem human? Rav Yaakov Emden has a shaila, can you be mitztaref a golem for a minyan? If you have 9 people and a golem walks in, can you count him for a minyan? But pashtus not. But the question becomes, what's the nafkamina? If the golem can think like a human and do everything like a human. Now, there was some book that was written, again, I think it was a novel, about genetic engineering on gorillas, in which different human DNA was introduced. So the gorillas were getting smarter and smarter and smarter. And the question becomes, when do they cross over the line between gorilla and human being? So the scientists were concerned. They said, when the gorillas started fighting, that meant they were becoming too human-like. That's when they were worried, because gorillas in nature don't fight with each other that much. So mystically, the answer would be, just because you have intelligence, that's not the same thing as divinity. Divinity is a certain X factor. But the problem is, how do you quantify it? How do you measure it? How do you define it? We generally define human beings by what they can do. That's kind of our normal definition. And when you have everything a human being does that's replicated by a machine, and all you're left with is the abstraction of the godly soul, which is a true statement. But the question is, we can't even quantify what that means apart from the functionality of a human being, which is largely duplicative by machines. So I've seen people, different rabbis even, trying to show why human intellect is different than AI. And I would love to be able to give you a definitive answer why it is different. But I have to admit to you, just in all honesty, I am not satisfied with the answers that have been proposed. That, human beings can have the power of abstraction. Well, again, I mean, what these things are doing is very, very, very close. And I haven't yet seen a clear demarcation and a line that will not eventually be crossed. Of course, keep in mind that obviously, well, again, here we also get into science fiction. I mean, all of this AI comes from human intellect and human creativity. So essentially, they are created by man, who in turn is created by God. So everything comes from God. The nightmare scenario is, again, this is the subject of numerous movies and books, is when do the machines start creating the next generation of machines? Well, ask me the question when that happens, and we'll see if we're still around, and we'll see what happens with that one. But right now, it is still very, very clear that you need human beings to be able to do these things. Yeah.
So
When
Yosef was, Yosef is called at different times in the Torah, he's called an Ivri. And even the cupbearer knew that he was an Ivri. So if so, then how come the brothers didn't chop that it was Yosef, since they could have just asked around and they would have known, this Ivri's in charge. Like, oh yeah, he's an Ivri.
Yeah, so the question is, if Yosef was known in Egypt itself, Yosef was known as Ivri, from the land of the Hebrews. So every Egyptian knew the origin of this fellow who had been a slave and all of a sudden and in prison and all of a sudden elevated to the highest. It was like a political legend in Egypt. So why would the brothers be so oblivious that everybody in Egypt knows he's Ivri, except for the brothers who don't know that he's Ivri and the like? That's a very good question. The only thing I can think of is that it could very well be, possibly, although I'm not aware of a chazal to this effect, that once Yosef became powerful, he may have given some type of order, don't talk about my background, because it's like a guy who becomes super wealthy and comes from a very poor origin might not want people to know about those origins. And in those days, censorship was censorship. It wasn't like today, people publish whatever they want. So it could be that Yosef Bedavka had that fact censored that nobody discussed. But as I say, I don't know if there's Beferish Makor in Chazal for that. Yeah.
With Bnei Israel residing in Mitzrayim for such a long time, and all the history and events that transpired there, how come there still hasn't been any archaeological evidence that has shown a connection with the Bnei Israel in Mitzrayim? There's been kind of pottery, or especially considering that when 3 million of them would have left, it would have been a cataclysmic event, at least on the Egyptian society. And in reality, the only thing we have is the Merneptah stele, which has the mention of Israel. We have so much archaeological stuff that has been found from Egypt and even in prior generations. There's been no record of the slavery there and the history of the Israelites within Mitzrayim.
Yeah, this is a very good question. It's a very famous question, and that is the Jewish people were in Egypt, according to our Masorah, for 210 years. They were not slaves for the whole time, because slavery didn't begin till after Yaakov and all of the Shvatim died. So they were only slaves for a little less than 100 years, actually. But be it as it may, they did have a significant presence, and the Torah talks about their miraculous growth. From 70 people, it became actually 3 million are the people who left, if you count the women, children, and the 600,000 men. And then if you consider the other measures, that 4/5 died, so you're talking about a population of more than 20 million slaves. And that should have left something in the archaeological record. And yet, it seems that most people say there's no real archaeological evidence. So first of all, there's a famous cliche which has some truth, and that is absence of proof is not the same as proof of absence, meaning to say, okay, you don't have proof, but on the other hand, you don't have proof that they weren't there. But the question still is, why would there be such a lack of evidence? So in truth, I have to say I'm not a great expert on this, but if you even Google the question, archaeological evidence of the Israelite slavery in Egypt, or the Israelite exodus from Egypt, you will find, and this primarily comes from Christian fundamentalists, that they have put in the time to try to show that there is perhaps more evidence than we might think is the case. For example, there is a lot of interesting evidence regarding the crossing of the Red Sea, in which chariots have been found at the bottom of parts of the Red Sea, indicating that there had been some type of calamity, drowning that occurred there. So you will have bits and pieces. It's not totally devoid of evidence. Why isn't there more evidence? It's hard to know. I mean, some have suggested that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it's one of the things that HaKadosh Baruch Hu did so that we would have emunah in the Torah. You know, it's an old idea. In fact, this goes even back to the age of the earth. Like, if Hashem made the world only 5,783 years ago, then why does the archaeological evidence seem to indicate an age that's, millions of years or billions of years? And there are a lot of answers, and I've given different answers over the years. One of the famous answers that people give is God made the world in an old state. God made a world 5,783 years ago that was of the age of 13 billion years. And the question is, well, why does God do that? Why is God pulling a trick on us? Why does God make a world? It's like he created a world 5,783 years ago that is billions of years old in terms of its geological age. And part of it is that God sometimes wants us to be in the dark, so we have to rely on emunah rather than evidence. And that's one of the ways that you come to him. So some have given a similar approach to that particular issue. But having said that, what often happens in life is that as generations get weaker in emunah, all of a sudden archaeological discoveries come. Meaning to say, when faith was strong, we didn't have it. When faith gets weak, so God kind of finds a way for different things to be discovered. In fact, the Chafetz Chaim, in a related matter, the Chafetz Chaim made the point that when the telegraph was developed, telephone was developed, he said that this was Hashem's way of teaching us something. Because it says in Pirkei Avos that you always have to know that God can see you from all the way up in heaven, that whatever you say, he hears. Whatever you do, he sees. And a person might have difficulty believing that. How can God see what I'm doing here? How can God hear what I say down on earth? The answer is, the telephone is an example of I talk here and you hear me 10,000 miles away. Radio, television, all of these different things. So the Chafetz Chaim actually said that a lot of these inventions are needed in a generation that's weak in emunah, so they will understand the notion of seeing and hearing at a distance. So by extension, I think you'll find that as history progresses and people get weaker in faith, there will tend to be more archaeological substantiation. Substantiation. So just Google it, and I think you'll find some interesting evidence. Yeah.
For context, I got in a discussion with my friend in Chabad about the halacha of beards.
Beards, you said?
Beards,
Yeah.
yes. And specifically, not about shaving the beard, but just trimming it.
Yeah.
So, can you speak about the halacha of trimming your beard? Like he was saying, for example, that the Chafetz Chaim said that trimming your beard is like acting in the ways of the goyim or something.
Yeah, so it's very, very interesting. In terms of the D'oraisa laws, the Torah prohibits what is called destruction of the beard. In fact, that's the verb that's used. Lo tashchis. Do not destroy the corners of your beard. And that basically means, like, don't take a razor and cut down to the skin level. And that is destruction of the beard. And then we get into the shaila. These are, what type of electric shavers are that close and would be forbidden? What type of electric shavers are not that close and would be allowed? Okay, that's a question of degree. But the point basically is, unless you cut part of the beard down to the skin level mamish, that is not hashchasa, and it is mutter. So trimming a beard absolutely is not forbidden, according to the halacha. Nevertheless, Kabbalistically, there are inyanim in Kabbalah in which the beard represents a certain connection to God, a certain level of holiness, and therefore you shouldn't trim the beard at all. So those who follow those Kabbalistic teachings will not do it. But nevertheless, it's not possible to say it's usher halachically. That is not the right category. You could argue it's not proper. You could argue you're imitating the goyim. You can argue many, many things, but you cannot say that you're transgressing a Torah prohibition in that way. And in fact, there's a very big sefer written by a HaRav on the prohibitions of cutting the beard and shaving. And he brings like every opinion that's machmer. He brings no kulas at all, but every opinion that's machmer. And when he went around for haskamos for this book from Gedolim, he went to Rav Moshe Feinstein. And Rav Moshe Feinstein refused to give him a haskama. And he asked Rav Moshe Feinstein, what's wrong with my book? He says, your book is very wrong. He says, listen, Rav Moshe said, I don't trim my beard, I grow my beard. Obviously, I believe a Jew should have a beard. But I'm not going to say that it's usher to trim a beard. And your book says it's usher to trim a beard. I'm not going to give a haskama to a distortion of halacha, even though I myself follow exactly that particular practice. So I think that would be the approach. It certainly is not a halachic issue. Yeah.
I have a question about Pharaoh and Hitler.
Yeah.
But before, in regard to the previous question, I'd heard that one of the reasons there's no record is because it was such a busha for the Egyptians that they themselves destroyed as much evidence as they could. They didn't write anything about it on their cenotaphs or whatever they're called and so on. So
it's a possibility. I can't say that's an absolutely persuasive because after all, we have plenty of archaeological evidence about other defeats of other empires in history. Normally, it wasn't a question of total destruction, but okay, it is possible that happens.
So Pharaoh did things that the Nazis didn't do, and vice versa. Did the Nazis study what the last Pharaoh did and learn from them? Did they model themselves after the Egyptians? Who was worse, Hitler or Pharaoh?
Who was worse? Well, one thing I'll tell you, we have this Messiah, the way Chazal understand the Nevi'im, of the 4 exiles, which we talked about with Chanukah. We have the exile of Babylonia, and then Persia, and then Greece, and then Rome, and we're still in the Roman exile. And then towards the end of the Roman exile comes the domination of Yishmael, which are the Arabs. And then you have Moshiach, that we have to go through these 4 in the song Maoz Tzur that we were singing during Chanukah. We have the 4 exiles, Babylonia, Persia, Yavan, which is the Chanukah stanza, and Edom. But the only thing is, there's an exile that's a pre-exile, and that is Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim is the mother of all exiles. And the commentaries say every single galus is modeled in part on Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim included every component. Now, since Germany, since the Holocaust is part of the Edomite galus, right? It's the 4th galus. And the Edomite galus itself is rooted in Mitzrayim. So that would have to mean that the seeds of the Holocaust were indeed in Mitzrayim itself. And of course they were in Mitzrayim because Pharaoh did practice active genocide of throwing the babies in the water, although Baruch Hashem, it only lasted a relatively short amount of time. And of course slavery corresponds to the concentration camps in that way, right? The concentration camps, actually there were 2 different types of camps, sometimes not on the same site. There were death camps and there were slave labor camps. Now, Jews died in both places, but it was a different type of agenda. In a slave labor camp, the Nazis wanted to keep you alive at starvation levels as long as possible so they could squeeze work out of you. There were other concentration camps in which the goal was immediate extermination. 2 different camps, like Auschwitz, Birkenau, they were next to each other. One was a work camp and one was a extermination camp. So it's all modeled on Mitzrayim because Mitzrayim had both the slavery and it had the genocide at the same time. In terms of who was worse, it's hard to judge. Obviously, on some level, Hitler did more physical harm to the Jewish people than even Pharaoh did. On the other hand, one could argue that Pharaoh inflicted spiritual harm because in Mitzrayim we were on the 49th level of impurity sinking into the 50th level. So although Pharaoh was not that successful as he could have been in physically exterminating the Jewish people, Pharaoh was very, very successful in bringing us down to an extremely low level where we're hanging by a hair and the like. So it's always hard to kind of make a list of who's the worst villain, but they're both up there, and the roots of the Holocaust are absolutely in the Egyptian exile, because every Gullus experience comes from Mitzrayim. Yeah.
So the Gemara in Brachos says that when Shmuel was in the courtyard of the dead, trying to contact his father, he saw his friend Levi there, who was exiled from the Heavenly Academy since he had disrespected his Rebbe in life. But then Shmuel says, well, he knows me, so, let him in my schus, and they did. So how could that be in the Olam HaEmes that they're going to commute his sentence just because he knows a guy?
Protexia works everywhere, huh? Okay, they say. Yeah, it's a good question. I think a pshat might be, though, that all of us have zechuyos. Well, okay, let me start this way. Rabbi Eliezer once said, and he was speaking about Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, when Hashem judges us, that one of the eitzos that a person could be zocha to a favorable din, favorable judgment, is that you become a person that other people need. And the svara behind that is this: even if I do not deserve rachamim, but if you need me, then Hashem has to show me rachamim so that you can get what you need. See? And therefore, Rabbi Eliezer said, the more people need you, now there's the greater number of people that need you, the greater is your chance of rachamim, because Hashem cannot take you because you're needed by all of these different people. This is a story they tell about Rabbi Levin. Digression for a moment, but it's a very cute story. There was a life insurance salesman who was trying to sell Rabbi Levin insurance. And he kept on saying, if you die, who's going to take care of your wife? You have to buy insurance. So Rabbi finally told him, I'm afraid if I buy insurance, that's going to be very bad for me. Because he says, every Rosh Hashanah, Hashem decides, should Aryeh live or die? And Rav Aryeh, in his modesty, said, I surely don't deserve to live, but every Rosh Hashanah, the Malach, the Midas HaRachamim, says to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Rebbetzin Chana needs him. So Rav Aryeh says, I get life in the merit of Rebbetzin Chana, who indeed was a great, great tzaddikus in her own right. So what's going to be, Rav Aryeh says, I buy life insurance. So next Rosh Hashanah, the Midas Hadin says he doesn't deserve to live. And the Midas HaRachamim says, Rebbetzin Chana needs him. The Midas Hadin says, oh, no, she doesn't. He has life insurance. So he says, Fakert, as long as I don't have life insurance, Hashem has to give me life. The point I'm making is that sometimes you are given a zechus not because of you, you're given a zechus because of somebody else who needs you. In fact, the Yerushalmi says, sometimes you're given a zechus for your animals. We say on Shabbos from Tehillim, Adam uvehema tashia Hashem. Hashem saves man and animal. State in the Yerushalmi, he saves the man because of the animal. Who's going to take care of the dog, right? Hashem has to give you life because that poor dog shouldn't suffer because of your averis. Right, a plant, I don't know. So it could be the pshat is the following. Levi, mitzad himself, had an avera. He did not show kavod, mila. That would exclude him. But Shmuel has a lot of zechuyas. And Shmuel is basically saying, my olam haba is not going to be complete without Levi. I need Levi to be there. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, I got to let Levi in because otherwise I'd be hurting Shmuel, who doesn't deserve that honor. This mom is the same situation as Rabbi Eliezer said. Yeah.
Here's another send-in. There's a cultural stereotype of the domineering and controlling Jewish mother, and I've experienced this phenomenon many times. So I'm wondering where this comes from. Can this personality be traced all the way back to the matriarchs? To what extent is it accurate? As I once heard from a Jewish businessman, Jewish success is the direct result of Jewish mothers expecting and demanding success. Is this similar to the tiger mom of Chinese culture, or is there a fundamental difference? Can the Rav please elaborate on this topic?
Well, this is a very, very interesting point, and I'm not going to make a stereotype that every Jewish mother is that particular way. I mean, you all have mothers, so you all can make your own judgments and thoughts about what that is. But the connection to the imos, I think, is a very, very interesting and accurate connection. The imos cared about the type of child they were raising. They cared about their ruchnius. They cared about their connection to God. When they saw averos, they wanted to take action to be mesakein. They didn't have a live and let live philosophy. They had what you might call an active philosophy to try to make this holy and good. Now, it wasn't in the direction of making money and going to college. That wasn't it. It was directed to ruchnius. But the notion of what is pejoratively sometimes called pushiness, that's a very negative way of putting it, is really the notion that truly loving your child doesn't mean letting your child do whatever they want, but it's to guide and direct and take steps so that the person will be the best person they're able to be. And that indeed is one of the Yerushas we get from the Imais. And Sarah, for example, was a tough mother. When she saw Yishmael, I mean, Yishmael wasn't her own son, but when she saw Yishmael was a very bad influence on Yitzchak, she said, we have to take action. Avram had a hard time with that. Avram could not be masik that. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, your wife is correct. Whatever Sarah says, you got to follow. Now, what often happens is this. What often happens is, in modern society, that values that have their shirish in Kedusha get turned into values that now are operating more in a secular world. So if indeed Jewish mothers are, I'm not saying they all are pushy, are demanding, you come home with 4 A's out of 5 courses and mom's only comment is, where's the 5th A, that type of thing. Or you got to make the most money, or you got to go, or what do they say? The first Jewish president, somebody asked his mother, are you proud of your son being the first Jewish president? She says, well, his brother's a doctor. These are stereotypes. But you have to understand what's going on. What's going on is a certain techunas hanefesh, a certain midah of the nefesh is getting turned in secular directions. So we can look at that as negative. Yeah, it may be negative. But its shirish is a very spiritual, noble idea that if I am a parent, my job is to raise my child to be the best person he can be. So Jewish, I'll tell you this. Somebody once told me, a woman who was not frum, she became a balas tshuva later. She said that after college, she was traveling through Greece. And Greek men would go over to her, forgive for my, that's not the most sneeze example, and they would want to go out with her, and they would say, our Greek mothers told us we have to marry Jewish girls. Because a Jewish girl will be sure that the kids are dressed right, and they go to school, and they make money, and they have jobs, as opposed to maybe the Greek women are less makpid on those in Yanim. So the Greek men were told to look for good Jewish women who in their pushiness are going to be sure that the kids become in a good direction. Now, in that level, the way it's become perverted, so to speak, is very, very similar to the Tiger Mom. I don't know if you're familiar with this. Tiger Mom is actually, she's a law professor, but she wrote a book about the way she's Chinese, the way Chinese raise their kids. And she's kind of like an ogre in a way. Her kids couldn't do anything, no recreation at all. They had to, unless they had straight A's in every course, unless they could play at least 2 musical instruments, and unless they sang in a choir, anything else was not allowed. Recreation could only apply after all of those goals were met. And she pushed this for 30 years or whatever it would be, and all of her kids are, assuming they didn't have mental breakdowns, all of her kids are like high achievers. And she said, that is how you produce kids. So you're right, it is very similar to the Jewish way. But I do want to point out that what may have turned into a certain nagging and pushiness emanated from a kedusha that I have to direct my kids. And by the way, the Jewish pushiness has diminished somewhat, and it's not necessarily so good. You may have heard the expression that the Koreans are the new Jews. Have you heard that expression? Or the Chinese are the new Jews? It used to be that Jews were so ambitious to get into the best schools and to achieve. And what happened was the Jews became liberal and, self-esteem, and I'm okay and you're okay, and we shouldn't push people because they get hurt, their feelings get hurt when we don't make demands of them. So the Jews are indeed less successful in higher education than they used to be, and it was taken over by the Koreans, by the Chinese, that are doing all the stuff that pushy Jewish mothers used to make their kids do. And there's an expression in higher education that the Koreans are the new Jews. Okay, but as I say, I'm not endorsing pushiness. I'm just making the point that a Yiddish mama cares about her children. And hopefully the way it should find its expression is in Ruchnius and Kedusha. And if not, then it may be in those other areas. Yeah.
Two questions about Chanukah that we just finished. It seems to me that among all the holidays in Judaism, Chanukah seems to be at least one of the holidays that even the most affiliated Jews,
Yeah.
ironically, that even Jews that Tarbis Yavan, they do light the Chanukah candles, which is very ironic.
Yeah,
seems to me.
for sure.
So I'm wondering what exactly is that coming from? And question number 2 about Chanukah, which I'm not sure if it's connected, is that we sing Maoz Tzur on Chanukah, which mentioned, as the Rav mentioned before, we mentioned all the Golios. Why is this something that we specifically are singing about on Chanukah and not any other holiday?
Right. So first of all, you're 100% correct that Chanukah is one of the most widely observed Jewish observances. There are many secular Jews or unaffiliated Jews who don't go to shul. They're called the 3-day, maybe only 2-day a year Jews, first day of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and even then it's only part of it. In fact, some people think, it's interesting, some people think the most important part of Yom Kippur is Tekiyas Shofar at the end. so they'll say, I'm going to be there for Tekiyas Shofar at the end. That's where they want to go. But be it as it may. So you have a few things. So you have first day Rosh Hashanah, the second day is less important. Then you have Yom Kippur. Then you have Chanukah, and then maybe a Pesach Seder. Those are the big ones that people keep, even if they're not observant. So I'll give you 2 reasons why Chanukah is kept by everybody. One is more of a local political reason, and the other is a spiritual reason. The localized reason, the superficial reason, is that since this is the season of some very prominent Christian holidays, so people kind of want to say, if the Goyim have their thing, then we have to have our thing. And they look at it like Jewish pride because it's a way of giving our kids a substitute for what the Goyim have. And that's why they make a big deal of fancy gifts every single day, etc. In fact, there's even called the Chanukah bush, Rachmana litzlan, in which they have a bush or a tree and they call it a Chanukah bush and the like. So that's the superficial reason. But in Sifrei Hasidus, it actually says that Chanukah is a very, very deep idea. That even if consciously you don't think about it that way, your neshama is margish, a connection to those neiros. The neiros of Chanukah which represent the idea of both the light of the Shekhinah. I mentioned this idea that it says for the first 3 days of creation there was no sun. So what was the 36 hours of daylight? First day, second day, third day. It was the or of the Shekhinah that was Meir. After 3 days, that was put away, and the sun took its place. So that's called Or Haganos. The Or Haganos, the hidden light, was Mishtamesh for 36 hours. How many Chanukah candles do you light, not counting the Shamish? You light 36 candles over Chanukah. And it's brought down in Svarim that the 36 candles of Chanukah represent the 36 hours of the Or Haganos. So I look at that candle. My neshama is margish, a connection to the Shechina HaKadoshah. Even if I'm a secular person, I don't think about God, I think I don't even believe in God. But my neshama wants to be connected to that shaychus, to the Shechina. And it pulls me. It brings me in. I can't tear myself away from it. And of course, a neshama bichlal is called a ner. The pasuk says in Mishlei, ner Hashem nishmas adam. The neshama of a person is a candle lit by a Kadosh Baruch Hu. So in the ner Chanukah, I see both my neshama and I see the or of the Shekhinah. And those 2 ideas come together. And it's a very important idea that people may have conscious motivations for what they do, but that's not the real motivation. The real motivation is within them, and they can't even identify it. Rav Kook said that, for example, to give another example, about secular Zionism. A secular Zionist who wasn't from, that was even anti-Torah, when he talked about going to Eretz Yisrael, he says, I want to have a state like all of the Goyim. I want to go there for nationalism or communism or socialism. But Rav Kook used to say, that's what he thinks in his conscious mind. What's really happening is his neshama wants to be connected to HaKadosh Baruch Hu in Eretz Yisrael. Meaning, you give yourself reasons, but there's something deep inside of you that's a different reason. And I think the zika of Neiros Chanukah is the connection to the Shekhinah, and the neshama is also crying that even though it lives in chayshech, it lives in darkness, but just like the Neiros of Chanukah, the light permeates the darkness. So too the neshama, as it were, is praying that the light of Hashem should permeate, should expel the darkness. So there's very deep meanings. Now, one of the amazing ironies of Chanukah is, you're 100% correct. On one hand, we're celebrating the overthrow of Yavan, Hellenization, to be able to keep the Torah. And yet, I mean, I'll give you a simple example of how absurd it is. There is kind of a Jewish Olympic game. And the Jewish Olympic game is called the Maccabean Games. So to name an Olympic type game, which of course were created by the Greeks, after the Maccabees, who fought the Greeks and all they represented, in a way, I imagine would cause the Maccabees and the Hashmonaim a certain amount of tsar that their name would be appropriated for what is essentially a Greek ritual, like a Maccabean Games. Okay, but that's an example of which, in fact, many people, they totally reverse. The Maccabees stood up for freedom, and therefore Reform should have a right, to read the Torah at the Kotel, because that's what the Maccabees stood up for. I even heard Rahman al-Islan, an Orthodox rabbi, which is very hard to believe, blow my mind, he spoke in favor at a state legislature of legalizing gay marriage, which that alone is already a chilul Hashem, but to add a chilul Hashem on chilul Hashem, because he said it during Chanukah, not this Chanukah, but a few Chanukah, because he said, that's the message of the Maccabees, that we have to have freedom and we don't get oppressed. So to use the name of the Maccabees to call for an endorsement of gay marriage is, at a minimum, a little incongruous, a little bit of a strange association. So you are correct that unfortunately the Maccabees have been besmirched and used for all sorts of illicit causes that they never would have. They ought to bring a trademark infringement or copyright infringement lawsuit against the name of the Maccabees. But still, as I say, the neshama is margish. There's something very, very powerful in the Neiros of Chanukah. Yeah. Oh, and in fact, the Chedush Yarim says, the Gemara says Masechah Shabbos, listen to this. Psilei Sushmanim, she'ein madlikin behem b'Shabbos, madlikin behem b'Chanukah. What is that talking about? In the Perek b'mem madlikin, there are certain wicks and fuel that you're not allowed to use for Shabbos candles, because since it flickers and the like, and you're allowed to read by the Shabbos candles or eat by the Shabbos candles, the Chachamim were afraid you might try to adjust the flame. But those oils and wicks are kosher for Chanukah, because since you're not allowed to read by the Chanukah candles, we're not afraid you're going to adjust it. That's what the Gemara says. But the Chedush Yarim interprets it al derech hadrush, that a neshama is called a ner. So it says, even those neshamas that Shabbos doesn't ignite, Shabbos doesn't get to them, Shabbos does not elevate them, Chanukah will get them, right? Psilos u'shmanim she'ein madlikim behem b'Shabbos, madlikim behem b'Chanukah. Oh, then you asked a final question. You asked about Maoz Tzur. So it's an interesting question. Maoz Tzur is largely not about Chanukah. Of all the stanzas of Maoz Tzur, there is only one stanza that is about the Chanukah story. That's the one that we sing as a separate song. Yevanim nikbetzu alai. The rest of Maoz Tzur is about Mitzrayim, and it's about Bavel and Paras, and then the last stanza is Edom. So the question would be, why don't you sing Maoz Tzur, every holiday, because Hashem is saving us from all of the gullus. I don't have a direct answer for that. I mean, all I can say is that the mechaber of Maoz Tzur did write the song for Chanukah, and the reason why it has 6 stanzas is because his name is Mordechai. He had to have he had to have a stanza for each initial. But he was never suggesting that the whole teichen of the song is only for that. But Chanukah is a time where we were delivered from an enemy, and therefore we thank Hashem for all of the taivas. But it's an interesting question. Yeah.
Given the fact that during the time of the redaction of the Mishnayos, that the Sanhedrin was still active, how are their machlokes recorded within that?
Yeah, that's a very, very excellent question as well. I mentioned this morning, and I've mentioned before, that the Sanhedrin of 71 is the definitive interpreter of the Torah Shebaal Peh, and whatever they say is the halacha, even if you're the greatest rabbi in the world, and you're either not on the Sanhedrin or you're a dissenter. You know, it's 36 to 35. You're in the 35. You know, you simply are not allowed to even follow your opinion. If you do, you're called a zaken mamre, a rebellious elder, and you're chayav misa, actually, in that particular case. So that would mean when you have a Sanhedrin, in theory, there is no room for any type of machlokes. Because if some rabbis said this and some rabbis said this, there would be a vote. And if there's a vote, whatever the majority ruled would be the halacha. So yeah, there could have been a machlokes before they made a decision, but there couldn't be a machlokes after they made a decision, because the decision is binding and final, maybe subject to a later Sanhedrin. You know, reversing it, that's a separate issue. But how could there be machlokes? How could there be a machlokes? Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Meir. There was a Sanhedrin in those days. So what you have to say is this. What you have to say is that there were many, many times where the Sanhedrin did not vote. And in fact, we have a phrase Chazal use. They sometimes talk about amdu leminyan. They did a count. And sometimes loy amdu leminyan. And the idea was, when there were sharp opinions of great rabbis, the Sanhedrin sometimes had a shita. We don't want to be machriya right now, and the Talmidim of each Rebbe should follow the opinion of their Rebbe. Which means there may have been a lot of machloksim that they could have paskined, but the Sanhedrin B'davka did not paskin it because there was not a consensus that would cause machlokas, etc. So this is what you would call, in modern legal terms, you would call this a voluntary abstention to let the Chachamim have different shitas, and maybe in the course of time they would come to a clarity, they would come to a haskama, and then there would be a psak. Which means most of the time the Sanhedrin didn't want to do things by 36, 35 votes. Most of the time they wanted there to be a consensus in which everybody was masking. And when the vote was very close, instead of, see, not like the U.S. Supreme Court, right? That's why you have these 5-4 decisions and whatever it would be. The Sanhedrin tried to avoid that because, if you're going to a regular Beis Din and it's just, I'm suing you for $100, all right, so the Beis Din's going to paskin. But when you're dealing with the whole future of Klal Yisrael, you don't want to make decisions by 36, 35, where 49% of the Chachamim thought this was a mistake. For Klal Yisrael, you don't want to work with 51%. You want to work with a haskama. So that's why there's so much what I would call abstention in the Mishnah, where the different dayas are recorded. Yeah.
So my question is about the exile from Egypt in terms of the big picture of making sense of the narrative, and also in terms of the revelation itself. And that is, in the revelation, if God show Himself, what's the point that He also mentioned that He did the exile from Egypt? That when God showed Himself in front of all Israel, so it kind of like changed the whole picture completely. And also in terms of right now that we, in Pesach, to remind the exile. So again, if we have like God showed Himself, so just what?
If we have what?
God showed Himself.
Yeah.
So what's the point of mentioning it?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So your basic question is that once we have the revelation at Mount Sinai, where HaKadosh Baruch Hu reveals Himself to the entire 3 million people in a miraculous supernatural way, why do we need to constantly bring up Yetziat Mitzrayim, the Exodus, and all of those things? L'chaira Matan Torah takes care of everything. That's a very, very good question. I think the answer is that Yetziat Mitzrayim is the source of our obligation to God, meaning the following. Yeah, God exists, but who says I have to serve God? What obligates me to be God's servant? Just because he exists? Is it just because he's like a bully? I better listen to him because he could squish me like a fly if I don't listen to him. So we say no. He says the fact that God liberated us from slavery, that we were slaves, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu was the one that gave us freedom. And freedom is life and the ability to live and the ability to accomplish. And that creates a debt. That creates a responsibility. So Yetzias Mitzrayim is not so much evidence that there's Hashem. We certainly have that evidence by the revelation of Sinai itself. But Yetzias Mitzrayim is what creates the debt. It's what creates the obligation. Ki avadayhem, Hashem says in the Torah. You are my slaves because I took you out of Mitzrayim. The Ramban points out, it says in the Ten Commandments, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am Hashem, your God, Asher hotzeisicha me'eretz Mitzrayim, who took you out of the land of Egypt. So the Ramban brings a famous kasha. Why doesn't it say, I am Hashem who created heaven and earth? Why pick the Exodus? So there's a lot of answers. One answer is, well, creating heaven and earth applies to all human beings. But Hashem wants to pick a unique claim he has on Am Yisrael. The unique claim of Am Yisrael is he took us out of Mitzrayim. But the Ramban gives another answer. The Ramban's answer is that some people believe in God, that God created the world, but after he created the world, he's not interested in what we do afterwards. I mentioned this morning that's called deism. So Yetzias Mitzrayim teaches me not only that Hashem created, but that Hashem is still involved in the world in a day-to-day, in the sense of punishing evil, rewarding good, taking care of those he loves. Yeah.
How do you make the connection between the exile and that he's still involved?
No, because here's the thing. HaKadosh Baruch Hu brought all of these plagues on the Egyptians because of their sinful behavior. Meaning Hashem is involved. Hashem didn't just create the world and is then indifferent, but he's actively involved in vice and virtue, in reward and punishment, right? This is called hashgacha, meaning Hashem is not only a borei, a creator, Hashem is mashgiach. Mashgiach is divine providence every moment. So those are the two things that Yetzias Mitzrayim teaches us. It teaches us that Hashem is not only a borei, but he's actively mashgiach, and it creates a debt that we owe Hashem because he took us out of slavery. The Gilui at Matan Torah would not have created an obligation. That's why Matan Torah has to come after Yetzias Mitzrayim, because it's the debt that we have to Hashem that creates the obligation to keep his mitzvahs. Yeah.
So after the events of the famous story about Lo B'Shamayim, so the Gemara says that they took all of Rabbi Eliezer's instruments that he deemed tahor, and they smashed them and burned them in front of his eyes. So firstly, why'd they have to smash them? Why not just make them tahor? And even the ones they couldn't make tahor, why'd they have to do it in front of his eyes? I mean, they were going to exile him anyway, so why not exile him and then smash all this stuff?
Yeah, so first of all, the smashing, I'm assuming, I have to see the Lashon of the Gemara. There are certain things you cannot purify in a mikvah. If something is earthenware, for example, you have to smash it. There's no way of purifying it. So it could be I have to see the Lashon of the Gemara, but it could be that the Lashon of smashing might refer to earthenware, kli cheres. That's one answer. There may be another answer as well, and that is they didn't want to purify them, because if they purified them and used them, people might later say, oh, you're using Rabbi Eliezer's stuff, because they wouldn't realize there was that step in between, right? That's another possibility. Now, why they did it in front of him, I think the assumption is they thought that maybe that would make him do tshuva and accept their decision. They were wrong, that didn't happen, but it could be they wanted him, B'dafka, to see this, because even though he has a very good advocate on his side, he has HaKadosh Baruch Hu on his side, but halachically he was mechuyev to retract his position. So they wanted to do it in a very emphatic way that he would be choser and be moded to them. Okay? Yeah.
If someone locked someone else in a basement for a year and gave them food and gave them work and everything, at the end of the year they said, okay, you can come out now. I don't know if the person who'd been freed from the basement would be so full of gratitude forevermore. We're constantly, daily thanking Hashem for taking us out. There's never a word said about the fact that he's the one who put us there.
Yep. That's a very excellent question. Meaning, why are we so grateful about God taking us out of Mitzrayim when it was God's decree that made us slaves? And the example you're giving is exactly right. I throw you into jail, and I come and I release you, and I release you earlier than I said I did. Right? You should have been there 400 years. I come after 210 years, and I say, be grateful to me because not only am I releasing you, but 190 years early. Wow, I'm so good to you. Well, you might not want to argue with me because you don't want to go back into prison, but certainly in your mind, you're thinking, what type of type is that? You shouldn't have put me in. Yeah, it's a very good question. But the short answer has to be that we're not just grateful for the freedom. If the pshat would be that the only tayeles is the Yitzias Mitzrayim, we would have a taina. Why'd you put me in Mitzrayim? But on a deeper level, we are grateful not only for the Exodus, we're grateful for the Shibud as well. Meaning, when we got freed from Mitzrayim, it's not simply we were where we were before there was an Avdus. Meaning, we didn't just go back to square one. But the Avdus itself transformed us, even in positive ways. And I'll just mention B'kitzer, 2 ways that this happened. You know that Chazal have the famous saying, although it comes in different versions, there are different Mamorei Chazal exactly, that although the Jewish people were in the 49th level of Tumah, there were certain merits that saved them. They didn't change their names, they didn't change their language, they wore distinctive Jewish clothing, they didn't speak Lashon Hara against each other, they didn't intermarry. Again, certain Makarists give one group of 4. There's always 4 things, but there's a total of 6 or 7 things, but the 4 things vary from Mechilta to the Gemara Saita and the like. Now the Beis Levi asks Akasha, how can you say they didn't assimilate, meaning they kept their special ways? It's brought down that after Yosef died, the Yidden made a kal v'chaimer. If we're so beloved when we're different and distinct from the Egyptians, kal v'chaimer, they're going to love us if we become like the Egyptians. So b'dafka, after Yosef died, the Yidden assimilated. They stopped speaking Hebrew. They stopped wearing Jewish clothing. They wanted to be like the Egyptians, and that's why Hashem caused Pharaoh to hate them, so they would know they have to be different. So we have a stira. Did they remain separate, or did they try to assimilate? Says the Beis Halevi, originally they tried to assimilate. It was the Avdus that made them realize we have to be different. The Avdus was a bracha. It made us realize we cannot be like the Goyim. We have to be different. In fact, I once wrote an article with a little bit of a provocative title. It was called The Hidden Blessings of Anti-Semitism. Not that we wish for anti-Semitism and we should fight anti-Semitism and the like, but anti-Semitism is one of the blessings of Hashem to remind the Yid that you can't say, Niyeh kagoyim, we'll be like the Goyim. The more we try to be like the Goyim, the more the Goyim are going to push at us and reject us. And we see this. So that's one thing we learned from Mitzrayim. And there's another thing we learned from Mitzrayim. Right? The Torah says that Mitzrayim is one of the shirashim for rachamim and compassion that we have for people who are persecuted. Right? You should love the ger because you were gerim in Eretz Mitzrayim. You know what it's like to be poor and oppressed and rejected. So the point I'm saying in answer to your question is, if the only thing I was grateful for is the freedom, I might very, very well be resentful that Hashem put me through the slavery. But if I understand that the slavery itself has gifts that it gave me, then fakert, I can be grateful even for the avdus itself. That's kind of the message. That's a very important message in life. On the deepest level, when we go through difficult times, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives us a Yeshua, it's not just the Yeshua that we're grateful for. We should even be grateful for the difficulty out of which we were saved, because the difficulty has the potential to develop within our personalities certain midas of strength and resilience and courage that we otherwise wouldn't have had. This is the meaning of a pasuk in, I think it's Yeshayahu, Eitcha Hashem ki anafta bi. That means, I am grateful to you, Hashem, for you were angry at me. So although the simple pshat is you were angry at me and then you forgave me, etc., but some say, the Sifrei Chasidus say, I'm grateful even for your anger, because that gave me some kinyanim in my nefesh that I otherwise wouldn't have had. Yeah.
Due to our history with false Moshiachs and the like, to some extent, our Rabbanim made themselves unreliable when it comes to determining who is and who isn't the Moshiach?
Well, I mean, this is a difficult issue. I mean, let's take Shabsai Tzvi. I don't want to go after Shabsai. Let's go back a long time ago. And you are certainly correct that there were some Rabbanim who at least initially thought that Shabsai Tzvi was the real Moshiach. On the other hand, most Gedolim understood that he was not. So I wouldn't call this a wholesale rabbinical failure, as it were. And I think you'll normally find that. And this goes back to the notion, again, this is a delicate topic. We do not believe that Das Torah is infallible. You know, the Catholics have a doctrine called papal infallibility, which is very rarely invoked, by the way. The Pope has to say that he's making this infallible and kimat. He's only done it like 5 times or something. It's like never done. But it means that if the Pope decrees something is emes, it is emes no matter what, infallible. It is directly from God. We don't automatically believe that. If you ask me, can great Gedolim make mistakes? The answer is they can. Have great Gedolim made mistakes? The answer is they have. Now, you may say, well, how can I say that? So now, why should I listen to a Gadol? Well, once again, I would answer very pashut. I listen to a Gadol because of reasonable probabilities. Meaning, a Gadol says something, I disagree. Could he be wrong and I be right? Yeah, maybe I'm right. What are the chances? 1,000,000 to 1? 1,000,000,000 to 1? So, what should I do? Should I say, maybe I'm right, so I'll do what I think is right? Or do I go with the odds? So really, I mean, I hate to say it this way, Das Torah is a matter of being a reasonable gambler. Meaning, it's not that it's 100% right, but there's a much better chance that it's right than what I think. So that's why I follow a Gadol, because a Gadol is closer to Hashem, and a Gadol is more likely to be right. But if you're asking me, is it shaykh a mistake? The answer is it is shaykh a mistake. Now, you see from the Gemara a very, very fascinating point. You see from the Gemara, if you remember the story of the Chorban by Yesheni that we learn on Tisha B'Av. So Rav Yochanan ben Zakkai was very much against the war against Rome. He felt we were not worthy of an Yitzchak, and indeed he was right. He said, if you fight the Romans, everything's going to be destroyed. So at some point, he wanted to sneak out and negotiate some type of peace with the emperor, or the general later, Aspasianus, who became the emperor. And the Kanoim, the Beryanim, the hooligans, the war party, didn't want to let him go, and he had to be taken out as a dead body. He had to be in a coffin, etc., and they wanted to even put the sword through the coffin to be sure that he was dead. Anyway, he comes to Vespasian, he comes to Aspasianus. And Aspasianus says, well, what do you want? And he asks for 3 things. He says, spare the city of Yavne, where the Chachamim are going to go, and spare the family of Rabban Gamliel the Nasi. And Rav Tzadok, who was a great, great tzaddik, but he had fasted for 40 years, eating only a little bit at night, pay for the medical care of Rav Tzadok that he could regain his health. So the Gemara discusses later that Rav Yochanan ben Zakkai should have asked to spare the Beis HaMikdash. What went through his head? he was able to ask for whatever he wanted, and he didn't ask for the Beis HaMikdash. So the Gemara quotes a pasuk. Again, I think it's in Yeshayahu. Meishiv chachamim achor, v'daitam yisakel. That sometimes there's a midas hadin in the world in which God takes away the wisdom of the great. So they won't be able to avert an evil decree that Hashem has decided we have to have. Now, there is a machlokes in there, because another Amman Diomer says, no, Rav Yochanan had a cheshbon. He thought if he asked for the Beis HaMikdash, he was asking for too much. This is the statement, tafastim meruba, don't ask for too much, because then you'll get nothing. But there is an opinion that actually says Rav Yochanan ben Zakkai made a mistake. And why did he make a mistake? It wouldn't be normal. But when the Eibishter has a midas hadin in the world, he will take away, even from the Chachmei HaTorah, the ability to avert that decree. So I think perhaps in the false Moshiach you had something along those particular lines.
So, without a specific hater, what is a person permitted to do in the morning before they daven?
In other words, what do you allowed to do before you daven? Yeah, so there's a lechatchila and there's a b'diavad. Lechatchila, for sure, the only things you should do before davening are things that are considered preparations for davening. Now, preparations for davening do include any type of cleanliness. So if you want to take a shower before davening, even though that's not mandatory, obviously, that is considered to be mutter, because any enhancement of nikiyos haguf is l'chavod hatfila, and that would be mutter. So showering for sure is mutter. The big question, eating, of course, is actually usher. You're only allowed to have either water, or some say unflavored seltzer, unflavored coffee, tea. Some are makel with a little sugar and milk. But anything beyond coffee, tea, generally, you're not allowed to do before davening. That's a fairly strict halacha. I know Chabad has certain kulas, other Hasidim have certain kulas, but unless that is your minhag, so to speak, one should be machmer. Now, a biggie that people ask is, what about exercise before davening? That's a big shaila. I want to jog. It's the only time I have, right? I want to jog. I want to, whatever it is, exercise. Now, logically, that shouldn't be a heter, because it has nothing to do with davening, unless somehow you get the blood running, so you daven with more kavanim, maybe that's shy. And yet, all I can tell you is that Rosh Shlomo Zalman did permit exercise before davening. If you wouldn't be able to do it afterwards, probably his cheshbon is that taking care of your body is considered to be a tzorich mitzvah, and therefore that type of mitzvah is mutter. Learning before davening is vaday mutter, and in fact it's considered to be a good thing to do. If you're stamazai just doing business or studying for a secular course, it's better not to do that before davening. So that's kind of the basic list. Yeah.
Number two questions on Perek Shira. Number one, how we understanding these Shamayim and Gehenna, and all these animals that are saying pesukim, like do they know these pesukim? What does that mean that they're saying pesukim? Like, what does that mean? And number two, why are Chazal, at the beginning of Perek Shira, Chazal are very much mishabeach people that are saying it? Why is it such a great thing to say?
Right. So Perek Shira, which is very popular among women in particular, but really it's from the Tanoim, and it's something that all of us can learn, is a very, very interesting thing from the Tanoim, from the time of the Tanoim itself, in which every type of animal, and sometimes even some trees, and even heaven and earth, Shemayim v'aretz, is assigned a pasuk that they sing to Hashem. Right? There's a pasuk for the rat, and a pasuk for the dog, and a pasuk for the cat, and a pasuk for the goose and the duck. So the question that Hari is asking is, do these animals know Tanakh? Like the dog, says, Bo nishtachah, right? So what does it mean that the animal sings a pasuk, or the ocean sings a pasuk? So the simple meaning is that vadai, nobody is saying that the dog or the cat or the rat says words. Rather, the whole idea of Perek Shira is really the same as the idea of Tehillim, Perek Yutes, which we say on Shabbos. Hashamayim misaprim kavod kel, umaise yadav magid harakia. Beautiful pasuk. The heavens declare the glory of God, and his creations proclaim his greatness. David HaMelech is teaching us in Tehillim that when I look at nature, I look at the sun and the moon and the stars and the plants, I see the greatness and the godless of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's why a Jewish person should, in fact, love nature in some ways. Because loving nature is you see the godless of the Bayrei. There's a famous word from the Kutzker Rebbe. It says in Pirkei Avos, this is a typical Kutzker reversal of how you would learn Pashat Pshat. If a person stops his learning and he says, Ma noya ilon zeh, how beautiful is this tree? Mischayev benafsho, he deserves to die. So the simple meaning is, I'm learning. What are you looking at trees when you're learning? You deserve to die. Kind of anti-nature. Don't look at nature. Look at the Gemara. The Kutzker Rebbe says exactly the opposite. The reason he's chayav misa is when he looked at the tree, he called that stopping his learning. Meaning, I learn, I think about Hashem, I look at the tree, I'm mafsik, I'm not connected to God anymore. But, says the Kutzker Rebbe, when looking at the tree is part of your learning about Hashem, then it's a good thing, not a bad thing. It's a good thing, Taka, a mafsik. So, going with that idea that nature is one of the ways that you learn to love HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So Perek Shira is telling us in a very deep way, and in fact, if you go into it, it's very, very deep, that each animal in its own way is expressing in its life, in its function, what is merumas in that pasuk. So when we say the dog has a certain, I'll mention dog because I happen to remember what the pasuk is. Okay, it says the dog says, "Bo nishtachava v'nichra'a lifnei Hashem Elokeinu." This is from Kabbalah Shabbos. Let us go and bow down and crouch before God. So the pshat is, it's not that the dog says those words, but the dog has the midah of loyalty. The dog has the midah of faithfulness. You know, I come from the Washington area, so the saying in Washington is, you want a friend, get a dog. You know, you're not going to find any human being that'll be a loyal friend, and the like. So memela, from the dog, I learn loyalty. And what does the pasuk say? Let us bow down in submission to Hashem, the way a dog bows down to the master. So that would actually mean Perek Shira is a you know, there's a lot of iyun that you could put into it, because essentially what you want to see is how each pasuk expresses the midah that the animal is showing in the world. That's what it means, that the animal praises God through that pasuk, meaning through the midah that pasuk is describing. Yeah.
So when Moshe Rabbeinu came back, when Hashem tasked Moshe Rabbeinu with coming back and or redeeming all the Jews, he said, well, they're not going to believe me that I'm the one. And Hashem said, don't worry, you know, change your staff into a snake and stuff, and they'll believe you. So, given that, so when Moshiach comes, Be'ezrat Hashem, tomorrow, so is he going to have similar signs to show that, like, he's the Moshiach, or are we just going to have to kind of take his word for it?
Yeah, well, that's well, it's kind of dangerous to take somebody's word for it. We've been down that path before, and it hasn't always been good. So the pashtus is this. This is interesting. Although the Rambam says once Moshiach comes, it will not be a world of miracles. The world will be a natural world, although you'll have the miracle of peace and the like. But the Rambam is mashma. In fact, he says that Moshiach will have to prove himself by a variety of miracles. That indeed there will be nisim that will show that he's the Moshiach. And again, and I'm pretty sure the Rambam analogizes it to Moshe Rabbeinu, that the process of Geula will be similar to the process of Yitzias Mitzrayim. Yeah.
It's recorded in Shmuel Aleph that once it was decreed by Hashem that Shaul HaMelech could not reign as king anymore, that a Ruach Ra overcame him. And I saw, I think it was Kliyakar, that when he also later on, when he lashed out at his son Yonatan, that he could not even be blamed for it because of his Ruach Ra.
Ruach Ra.
This seems to be a direct decree by Hashem to carry out the plan that David HaMelech could take over the throne and rid Shaul HaMelech of his duties as king, based on the Ratzon of Hashem. Is this a direct effect in the design of Bechira? And if it is, does that contradict the design at which Hashem originally had intended for his relationship with man?
Yeah, so those are very interesting questions. The Ruach Ra of Shaul is a subject of a continual fascination. Some say you're simply dealing with psychological depression, that Shaul had depression, very severe depression, or maybe even bipolar, we would call it today. Others say this is a special divine punishment to kind of take away his ability to function properly. Others say, I'm giving different pshatim, that the Ruach Ra was the spiritual pain he felt when he felt Hashem was no longer with him, meaning it wasn't like a separate thing that happened to him, but he was so close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And then there was a richuk from HaKadosh Baruch Hu that caused a tzebrachen. He was totally broken inside over the Ruach Ra. So in those definitions, it's not necessarily interfering with Bechira. If it's a psychiatric condition, it's like a condition. And if it's a result of his own Averos, then that is a consequence of Bechira, meaning it's not that he sinned. I mean, let's take Amalek. Amalek was his Avera. He didn't sin with Amalek because of the Ruach Ra. The Ruach Ra came afterwards, right? So, in a sense, the Ruach Ra was a consequence of his sin. It was not the reason for his sin. Now, once he had the Ruach Ra, he did other Averas, like pursue David or the like. But since they came as a result of his Bechira, that would not be an interference. But there's another point that's very, very complicated. There's a pasuk in Mishlei. It's quoted in Chazal, but the pasuk is never accurately quoted. The way the pasuk is quoted, but I know it's not the actual language of the pasuk. Leiv malachim v'sarim biyad Hashem. That means the heart of a king and an officer, a prince, is in the hands of God, and he directs it wherever he wants. That the rules of Bechira don't necessarily govern the decisions of kings and monarchs. Because since kings and monarchs, their decisions affect so many people, Hashem kind of takes over, which is a unique aspect that doesn't apply to the Yachid. Now, there is a problem with that. People raise the question, so why does it make a difference who I vote for? Because you're basically telling me whoever is in position, Hashem is going to control those decisions. So if a given president is bad for me, but the assumption is that the bad stuff would be done by the other guy, one way or the other, because Hashem is decreeing what happens. So what's the purpose? Now, I've heard people say this. I've heard people say that they don't vote, either in America or here, because they say it's not going to make a difference because Hashem controls the decision-making of every political leader. It's an interesting question. But some say that you're mechuyev to do hishtadlus in politics the same way you have to do hishtadlus in parnasa. Meaning, your parnasa comes from Hashem, but you can't just say, oh, I'm going to stay in bed, and the checks are going to come to me anyway, because after all, whether I work or I don't work, I'm going to make the same amount of money that Hashem decreed on Rosh Hashanah, so why should I work? I'd rather get the money and not work. But the answer is that it's a gezeira of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that the bracha comes only with a certain amount of hishtadlus, whatever that amount is, so that's why you have to work. So some say, I think most people would say, that the same issue of hishtadlus applies in politics as well, meaning to say, yeah, Hashem is going to decide one way or the other, either way, but you have to make the reasonable effort to vote for the candidate who b'derech hateva would come up with the things that are best for Klal Yisrael and for Am Yisrael.
What does the Torah say about practicing yoga?
Yeah, well, the Torah does not directly talk about yoga, but in terms of generally, if halacha allows yoga, this is a big controversy that's very, very nogea l'maisa, obviously, and yoga is part of a much larger issue. There's many, many things that are based on Hindu or Eastern cultures. There's alternative medicine, whether it's acupuncture, whether it's energy healing, all sorts of things there. And then you have yoga, meditation, all of these things, which have their source in Eastern religion. And Eastern religions, like Hinduism or Buddhism, seem to be idolatry. So you're talking about things that are based on idolatry. So the question is, am I as a Jew allowed to get into any of those Eastern religion things, that, or at least that have their origin in the Eastern religion? And the truth of the matter is, many Baalei Tshuva come to Yiddishkeit after a strong background in these Eastern religions. And if you go around Jerusalem, you look like half of, they say that in Hollywood or in Los Angeles, every waiter is writing a screenplay. Everybody is in the movement. So here in Yerushalayim, anyone that's not in yeshiva is an alternative healer. Everybody does alternative medicine here in Eretz Yisrael. It's very, very popular. Energy healing with haskamas. So, as you might expect, there's a big machlokes about a lot of these things. There is an opinion that says that anything that has its origin in the Eastern idolatrous religions, it is absolutely forbidden for a Jew to be involved in, because you're benefiting from idolatry, and even spiritually you're allowing the forces of idolatry to penetrate your neshama, and it's asur mamish. But most poskim, are actually lenient, because they say that it's possible to detach a technique from its origin. Meaning, yoga may have started as a meditative, idolatrous, ritualistic worship practice, but it's morphed, for most people who do it, into exercise, relaxation, flexibility. And it's as if you cut it off. You've severed it from those tameh connections, and now we regard it as neutral, and as a result, there is such a thing as kosher yoga. The only thing you have to be careful of is you may have to be careful about your instructor, because there are going to be yoga instructors, let's say they're not Jewish, who will in fact use this as a ritual of worship to different types of gods, and you're not allowed to take instruction in that particular modality. You have to go to a yoga teacher who teaches it as like any other exercise technique. Flexibility, bending, whatever it is. So it is shaykh. If you ask me, is it shaykh to have kosher yoga? The answer is yes. Is it shaykh to have kosher acupuncture? The answer is yes. Is it shaykh to have kosher energy healing? That's a bit more controversial. Even then, I think the answer is yes. Meaning to say, the Yesod HaDvarim is that just because something originated in Avodah Zarah, that doesn't mean it can't become a neutral thing afterwards. Same thing with meditation. It's interesting that meditation is actually very popular and helps many people. Now, you may know, Rav Aryeh Kaplan, Zichrono Livracha, wrote 3 books showing that meditation has a long history in Judaism, and it's lav dafka from Hindus and the like. But Lubavitcher Rebbe had a different approach. It's interesting. He didn't like Rav Kaplan's approach, because I'll tell you why. He had a very interesting point. He didn't want to make meditation a religious thing. He wanted to keep it a neutral thing. He said, don't tell me meditation is connected to Kabbalah and it's connected to all these. No. Because once you connect it to religion, you're also connecting it to the Eastern religion. He says, keep it neutral as relaxation. So it's interesting, machlokes. Right? You have people like Rav Kaplan who were trying to show that meditation has makairos of Kedusha. And then you had the Rebbe, who took the position, I don't want to connect it to Kedusha, and I don't want to connect it to Tumah. I want to connect it to neutral. And you should not bring in any religious ideation into meditation, because there's too much of a risk that you're opening that religion box in which some of the other stuff is going to come in. It's an interesting machlokes. It's a very interesting machlokes, whether you want to give a religious dimension to meditation. Of course, what Breslov does with hisbaidus, is really, kind of meditation, just with another word, another term for it. But essentially, that's exactly what it is. Yeah.
So the Jew has a Christian father.
Yeah.
He recognized the holidays, the
So the question is, if a person has a non-Jewish father and they quite correctly want to have a good relationship with their father, how do you celebrate or acknowledge the various non-Jewish holidays? So this is a tough one. Let me give you things that for sure you shouldn't do. You should not be with your non-Jewish father to celebrate a Christmas dinner. Thanksgiving, I think, even that's a controversy, but at Thanksgiving I can give you a heter for. Go and have Thanksgiving, or even go for the secular New Year, but Christmas, Easter, you should not go for a formal dinner. The question is, can you wish somebody, or your parents, or anybody really, Merry Christmas? L'chatchila, certainly better not to, because Christmas, first of all, the word Christ is a problematical word. Christ is Greek for Messiah or King, and it has a connotation of at least semi-divinity. So when you wish somebody Merry Christmas, what you're saying is, I hope you enjoy the day of the birthday of the Messiah King. You know, that's not the way a Jew should talk. So some say you're allowed to say Happy Holidays, season's greetings, all of these different things. So those you can say if there's a need, but you try to avoid the Christmas directly. On the other hand, some are even makel. Some say, at least if you're speaking to a non-religious Christian. So to a non-religious Christian, there's not necessarily any religious thing about this day, December 25th. It's just a day off from work. So if the person himself, if the Christian themselves are not regarding this as a religious day, then you're allowed to even use the word in those circumstances. Yeah.
In this fall to that, do we have any, like Medrash or any other commentary that talks about Abraham and how he treated his father, like his any years, or his father did tshuva or anything?
Yeah, there is a discussion of Terach doing tshuva, and it also mentions that when Avram was commanded to come to Eretz Yisrael, he was very hesitant because he would be leaving his elderly father in Haran, but God said he has to make that particular decision. But we know very little about what was Avram's relationship to his family after he came to Eretz Yisrael. But we do know that obviously all of the wives, Yitzchak's wife came from Avram's brother, and Yaakov's wives came from that same brother, just one generation down. So Avram was obviously very connected to his family, at least in that way, in the long run. So Terach has the zechus of being kind of the ancestor of the Jewish people. Yeah.
The Gemara in Tanit recounts a story where there are rabbis, having a meal, let's say, and there was one Talmid Chacham who was sitting at the edge of the table, and he was like much greater than the rest of Talmidei Chachamim, and he said, "Oh, come over here, like, what are you sitting down there for? Come join us." And he responds, "Ein hamakom mekabed et ha'adam, ela ha'adam mekabed et hamakom." And he brings a proof of that from Har Sinai, where as long as the Shekhinah rested on Har Sinai, the animals and the people couldn't go up the mountain. And once the Shekhinah left, then the mountain was mutter for everything. So that being the case, we say that when Israel went into exile, the Shekhinah went with them. So insofar as the Shekhinah is anywhere, it's certainly not on Har-Bayit any more than it is anywhere else. So why is there the Shita that says that Har-Bayit still has its Kedusha if there's nothing there to grant it the Kedusha, and the Makom doesn't have Kedusha in and of itself?
So here's the thing. I think that itself is the machlokes. For example, the Shita of the Rambam is that the Shekhinah is still in the Makom HaMikdash even when there's no Beis HaMikdash. He darshans this. It's based on a Sifra, Teres Kayanim. V'hashimaisi es mikdashechem. I mean, Hashem says, I will destroy your temples. So the drasha is, even when they're destroyed, they're still your temples. I mean, according to the Rambam, let me point out, according to the Rambam, you would actually be allowed to bring korbanos on the Har Habayis even bisman hazeh. It has kedushas hamikdash mamish. So we're honoring the Temple Mount not because it once was the place of the Shekhinah. We're honoring the Temple Mount because it is the place of the Shekhinah. Now, the Ravid actually paskins you're allowed to go in the Temple Mount even if you're Tameh. That's because he says, exactly like you say, the Shekhinah is no longer there. But that gufa is the machlokes, meaning nobody is saying there's a prohibition because it once was holy. Rather, the machlokes is, does it have kedusha right now?
Then how does the Ramban
Yeah.
holds that the Shekhinah is in exile with us?
Yes. So you're asking me if the Shekhinah is in the Harabayas, is the Makam HaMikdash, and how is it Shayach to say Shekhinah Begalus? That's that's a difficult question because obviously, can Hashem be in more than one place? The answer is yes. So there's one Shekhinah, but He's here and He's there and He's there and He's there. But in fact, let me ask you a general. Let me ask you a more basic question. Let's go back to when there was a Beis HaMikdash, okay, where even you're saying the Shekhinah was clearly there. Now, does that mean God was only in the Harabayas? He wasn't in California. He wasn't in Utah. He wasn't in China. He wasn't in Timbuktu. Hashem is everywhere, right? Hashem is always everywhere. Hashem is called Makayim. In other words, what does it mean? Hashem is the location of the universe. In other words, Hashem is not located in the universe. The universe is located within Hashem. So what this means is this. What this means is when we talk about the Shekhinah is more here than there, that refers to the ability to access a connection to Hashem. Just like you have a cell phone, right? There are areas where you don't get reception. So when we say Eretz Yisrael is holier, that means I can access Hashem. So the Shekhinah is with us in the sense that we're capable of a relationship with Hashem even in Golus. And Hashem Kaviyachal suffers with us, but still the Makam HaMikdash is where He's most accessible, right? So you're going on accessibility, not here, there. Hashem is always everywhere. Yeah.
What does the Rav hold on celebrating Thanksgiving and eating like Friendsgiving?
What's the one?
Friendsgiving is like instead of with your family, you do it like with your friends.
Oh, Friendsgiving. Okay, I didn't know the name, but okay. Yeah. So like everything else is big machlokes. There were those who took the position that celebrating Thanksgiving is imitating Goyish holidays, and one should not celebrate a non-Jewish holiday. It's called Chukos Hagoyim. And in Eretz Yisrael in particular, which they're less connected to the November holiday, they kind of say Chukos Hagoyim. But I will tell you that there are American Gedolim that's, including Rav Moshe. Rav Moshe has a true, now I assure you, Rav Moshe did not celebrate Thanksgiving personally. But in terms of a psak halacha, Rav Moshe said a person is allowed to celebrate. I'm sorry, I want to be chayv. Rav Moshe was specific about it. But some paiskim for sure, Rav Soloveitchik, I know, used to go back to Boston. He would give share early on Thanksgiving to fly back to Boston to have a Thanksgiving dinner. And the concept is that since Thanksgiving is about hakaras hatov to Hashem, so that's a good thing. In other words, the isser of imitating goyim is only when it's connected b'dafka to avodah zarah, or it's a minhag of shtus like Halloween. But when it's a svara of hakaras hatov, that would be okay. So I think you could be makel. Now Rav Moshe himself said, that's why I want to backtrack from what I said, that one is allowed to have a dinner of turkey, but one should not say it's a Thanksgiving dinner. He shouldn't directly connect it to the Gaisha holiday. So Rav Moshe was a little stricter. But Rav Soloveitchik held you could mamish connect it to Thanksgiving mamish. Now some people suggest that it's okay to have turkey, but you should have turkey the day after Thanksgiving, Isru Chag, or make it for Shabbos. It doesn't have to be, in other words, maybe buy a turkey because it's cheaper around Thanksgiving, I think. They lower the price a little bit, so you could take advantage of it, but you shouldn't do it b'dafka on the day. So, if you're asking me, I don't feel strongly about it. I think yesh lo al ma'alismach, and my guess is that if you have a Friendsgiving thing, you're not doing it to celebrate some Gaisha holiday. You're doing it because you want to get together with people, and you might be homesick a little bit, and this lets you feel at home. So I think even Rav Moshe would say that would be permitted. Yeah.
So another question, this week's parsha. Within the story of the brothers, and Yosef revealed himself, and we're getting all emotional and whatnot. So the pasuk says that Yosef and Binyamin, they were embracing and they started crying. So suddenly Rashi says, they're crying on the Basei Mikdash and the Mishkan shield that are destroying. What's the why are they crying on that now? What's the connection of the story?
No, well, as you know, the Mishkan in Shiloh that was destroyed in the days of Eli, that's when Eli died and Shmuel became a Navi, The Mishkan of Shiloh was in the Chelek of Ephraim, which is Yosef. And then, of course, the Beis HaMikdash was in the Chelek of Binyamin and Yehuda, but Binyamin's Chelek. So Rashi brings that Yosef and Binyamin are crying because at that very moment of their unification, they have a premonition, they have a prophetic premonition that the Beis HaMikdash, or the Mishkan of Shiloh, which is Yosef, is going to be destroyed, and the Beis HaMikdash of Binyamin is going to be destroyed. So indeed, that is the case. The question is, why is it coming b'dafka at that time? You know, it's hard to know b'diuk. I mean, the Torah wants to emphasize the notion that in Olam Hazeh, there is no such thing as complete simcha until the Geula comes. That even at the happiest moments of reunification, there's an awareness that we live in a world of Chorban, we live in a world of Galus, and only b'Moshe Moshiach is there going to be a shleimus. The same way that as a chasna, we break a glass to remind us that even in our moments of simcha, we have to remember the Chorban. So this is like remembering the Chorban in advance. At the moment of our greatest joy, we have to know that there's nothing in Olam Hazeh that has permanence. You know, this can comfort you and this can also sober you. There's a medrash that says that Shlomo HaMelech went to a jeweler, an artisan, and he said, you know, make me a ring and put words on the ring that will tell me if I'm too gaivadik and arrogant, that I should be more humble. And when I'm tzebrachin or depressed because of my enemies, I should feel simcha. I want you to give me one formula that will help me with both of those issues. And the jeweler engraved on the ring 3 words, Gam ze ya'avor. This too will pass. So when I'm gaivadik and arrogant and wealthy and powerful, I remember Gam ze ya'avor. And when I'm sebrachin and weak and scared, Gam ze ya'avor. Gam ze ya'avor. So in a sense, the Torah often wants to be madgish, like by dramatic contrast, that precisely at the height of simcha, there's a premonition that this is not going to last.
Gamzer Yavar versus Gamzer Teva. Why?
Yes, no, you're right, but Gamzer Teva wouldn't answer everything. Gamzer Teva is a very good answer. When things are bad, I'm given the message Gamzer Tova. But if I have a problem, things are great, so Gamzer Tova is not going to make me humble. So I need the other message, Gamzer Yavor. So Gamzer Yavor works for both situations. Yeah.
We're not supposed to imitate the non-Jews, so...
You're not supposed to?
Imitate the non-Jews
Yeah.
and dress and everything. So why is it that Hasidim dress in the garb of Polish nobility and the rest of us dress in Western suits and ties and hats? The fedoras, came from America, I think.
Yeah. So that's a serious issue. That obviously a non-Hasidic Jew, b'derech klal, dresses like the non-Jewish world. And if a Hasidic Jew dresses different, that's only because Polish nobility has changed its fashions. Meaning, even the Hasidic levush is actually connected in some ways to the way people used to dress. So either way, there seems to be a Geisha influence in levush. So the poskim say this. The poskim say, as I said before, that the Isser, the technical Isser of Chukos HaGoyim, is only if you're following a custom that's connected to Avodah Zarah, or you're following a custom that's called shtus, that is just totally irrational and makes no sense, like Halloween costumes and the like. But if you're dressing because the dress is practically helpful, meaning it's a practical way to dress, let's say a short jacket might be more practical sometimes than a long jacket. So technically it is not chukos hagoyim, and it's permitted to kind of adopt the way people dress, because that's a normal way that people dress, meaning there was no religious message in that form of dress at the time.
So the Polish nobility dressed with the shtreimel, that's practical?
Well, I wouldn't say that. Listen, I don't know if we have photographs from those days. I mean, I wouldn't say that a Polish nobleman wore a shtreimel. I mean, obviously, Hasidic levush is an adaptation, but they did wear, like, you can see the Russians wear these fur hats. So the shtreimel was modeled after the fur hats that Russian and Polish people wore. Yeah.
How do we understand the concept that one can reject certain midrashim?
So, well, there are two versions of the concept. One version is a statement of the Ramban in his debate with a Catholic priest in Barcelona. He actually was a Jew who unfortunately converted, where the Ramban actually said that midrashim are not necessarily makubal from Sinai, and they represent individual opinions, and we don't have to accept them. That's an extreme version of the statement, and some say the Ramban himself does not agree with it. He just wanted to get rid of the missionary attacking, etc. But there's another version, which I think goes with the Rambam and the Maharal, and that is, there's no such thing as rejecting midrashim. All midrashim are true, but lav dafka literally true, meaning it's not that you reject a medrash. It's simply a position that what the medrash is trying to teach you is lav dafka literal. Now, it would be incorrect to describe that as rejecting a medrash. You're not rejecting a medrash. You're offering a pshat in the medrash that Chazal are conveying deep spiritual truths by mashal, by metaphor, and the like. That, I think, is a mahalech that's very well accepted by the Gra, by the Ramchal, by the Maharal, that midrashim are not always meant to be literal. Now, the Rambam writes, I think we went over this, that some midrashim are literal, and some midrashim are figurative and metaphorical. And the Rambam said, I'm going to write a book that will tell you. Actually, he wasn't talking about midrashim, he was talking about Agada and Shas, but it's the same thing. I'm going to write a book that will explain to you which midrashim are literal and which midrashim are mashal. But l'tzarenu hagadol, the Rambam didn't get around to it, or we don't have it at least. We don't have that book. So that's why the Maharal devotes all of his svarim to try to explain the symbolic meaning of midrashim. Yeah.
So recently I was walking through Me'asharim, and I saw they changed their signs at the entrance. Now, in addition to please dress modestly, they say, please do not take out your smartphone.
Right,
Don't
right, I
let
noticed
me
that.
even see you with a smartphone, even if it's kosher. I don't even want to see a smartphone.
Yeah.
So I wanted to know, what is the level of control a community can have to force others to do certain things, and like, how ridiculous can it go? Like, what? Yeah, I guess.
Well, certainly, Mea Sharim is part of the city of Jerusalem, right? So if you're asking me legally what they can do, they can't do anything.
Not on a legal
But
level,
halachically, it's hard to say. I mean, I think they could certainly be mavakesh whatever they want. I mean, they could request, please. They're not going to arrest you. They're not going to beat. Well, I can't say they're not going to beat you. They might, but the hope would be they wouldn't beat you up because of it and the like. And on the other hand, in terms of derech eretz and chesed, one should have derech eretz not to do things that are going to hurt people's feelings and the like, and the like. But in terms of a chiyuv, I don't think they have any right at all, actually, al pi din, because it's a rishus harabim, and a rishus harabim, you cannot be moineya, the rabbim, from walking in a rishus harabim, unless they're mamish, maybe if they're over averis mamish. But a smartphone, even if one shouldn't have a smartphone, because it could lead to different things, owning a smartphone is not an avera. There's no love you're over on with the smartphone. So I don't think they have the halachic right to exclude you, but I think it's a matter of derech eretz to not do things that hurt people. That's the general idea. Yeah.
I've had this discussion recently with others regarding the shame of Hashem, Yud Kei Vav Kei.
Yeah.
I see in certain Sfarim, Sidurim specifically, that there are nekudos under the around the word. Have we, at least by the majority, lost the Masorah to pronunciate it?
Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Is if there was a known way that with confidence we could say certainly was like the pronunciation, could it be said in certain contexts, and if not?
Yeah, so let me just point out a point which I think you understand, but not everybody may know this. We have Yud Kei Vav Kei, and in many Sidurim and in Tanakh, there are vowels under the Yud Kei Vav Kei, which would enable you to pronounce the words, apparently, based on those vowels. Just like the Christian group, that's the J witnesses, right? So the way they say it, except the J would be a ya sound. But that's incorrect. The vowels under the Yud Kei Vav Kei are totally different. They are not pronunciation vowels. They just indicate, sometimes Yud Kei Vav Kei is read as Adnus, Aleph Daled Nun Yud, and rarely it is read as Elokim. So the vowels are just telling you if it's read as Adnus or Elokim. So the vowels in one configuration are the vowels under Adnus, and the vowels under the other configuration are the vowels of Elokim. Which means the Shem HaMefarish in terms of pronunciation has no vowels, which means technically speaking, I wouldn't do this halacha just in case I'm wrong, because the consequences could be grave, but technically speaking, I believe you would be allowed to say the ya, ho, that, because that's not the pronunciation of the Shem HaMefarish. That's just Nekudas. You see? So the question then becomes, if the only function of the Nekudas under the Shem HaMefarish is to indicate whether you say it as Hashem or Elokim, what is the pronunciation of the Shem HaMefarish itself? The answer is we don't know. We lost the Messiah. We do not know how to pronounce the Shem HaMefarish. It was only pronounced in the Beis HaMikdash, not only on Yom Kippur, actually every day in the Beis HaMikdash, right? Not only on Yom Kippur, but nevertheless, we do not have a clear Messiah. Now, if you look at secular scholarly literature, they do pronounce it this way. I'll spell it out in English. Y-A-H-W, which is W-E-H, which is not the way the Nikud goes. And the truth is that is a possible pronunciation. I don't know, because we simply don't have the Messiah on it. So this is a very interesting point people don't realize. The Nekudas under the Shem HaMefarish are not telling you how to pronounce the Shem HaMefarish. It's just telling you whether you say Hashem or Elokim.
But sometimes it does refer to Hashem as Elokim
Yes,
specifically.
yes.
So why then would it need to indicate that it's really saying Elokim when it could just simply be written as Elokim?
Well, you can ask the same way the other way around. So why say the Shem HaMefarish when it's Hashem, Adnus, just say Adnus, right? So the answer is that there is a special Kedusha in the Shem HaMefarish. So sometimes the Shem HaMefarish is connected to the Rachamim and sometimes to the Din, but the Shem HaMefarish is higher than any other name of Hashem, so you want to connect it to the Shem HaMefarish. Yeah.
Question regarding Chidushei Torah. So I've
Yeah.
heard different opinions. Some people say that it's impossible to have Chidushim, everything was given to Moshe on Sinai, and other people say the other extreme, that every generation there's new Chidushim that being said. What's the Rav's understanding of this topic?
Yeah, so I think they're both correct, meaning to say every Chiddush Torah that's an emestika Chiddush is rooted and connected to what Hashem gave to Moshe. But Hashem didn't give to Moshe the specific Chiddush, meaning like this. Let's look at a tree. You have a mighty oak tree, an oak tree that's 50 feet high, I don't think, whatever, 20 feet high, with many powerful branches. The oak tree starts from a seed or an acorn. So in the acorn is the tree. But it's not in the acorn, but it grows from what is in the acorn. So too, everything has its roots in what Hashem told Moshe, but we develop it, we cultivate it, we expand it. And that's the meaning of the Gemara. The Gemara Taka says that Hashem showed Moshe Rabbeinu the future generations. And he sees Rabbi Akiva darshaning. And Moshe didn't know what on earth is Rabbi Akiva talking about. I never heard any of this. And Moshe had Chalisha Sadas. He got upset. He said, I don't understand the Torah. Until Rabbi Akiva said, oh, this is halacha l'Moshe Sinai. And then Moshe was happy. Well, wait a second. If it's halacha Moshe Sinai, why didn't Moshe know it? What do you mean? The answer is, this is a little bit of a chiddush. In what Hashem told Moshe is tamun, all of the development that happens. But Moshe was not necessarily consciously aware. of everything that comes out of the Torah. He was aware of every principle out of which everything comes, but he didn't have the specific awareness of that everything, you see? And that's why he could hear something from Rabbi Akiva and say, I don't know what he's talking about. But the answer is, it's rooted in halacha l'Moshe Sinai, right? Yeah.
There is a practice by some to keep the thumbin at Havdalah.
Keep the thumb in?
Yeah, I was wondering if the Rav knows the source for this and what the Indian is behind that.
I'll check. Off the top of my head, I don't know, but anyone, yeah. You have an answer?
No.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'll try to check it for you. Yeah.
I was wondering, this idea that Yaakov says a few times, like, about him going down to Shola.
Show, yeah.
I believe it's also used by Korach and probably also in Nach in many places.
Yeah.
What is this concept? Is it, because like doesn't Yaakov like believe in Olam Haba? Like what is this? What does it mean? Like who? Yeah. Like.
Yeah. So what is Sheol? What is Sheol? So there are different interpretations. Some Mefarshim actually learn in a very non-mystical way. They simply say Sheol means the grave. That's all it means. The grave, meaning Yaakov is saying, I'm going to die in grief. It does not have any otherworldly, netherworldly implications. So that's one pshat. Others, Chazal seem to say in Maseches Sukkah that Sheol is one of the names for Gehenna. Gehenna itself has different compartments, and Sheol is one of the compartments of Gehenna. And what Yaakov is expressing, the idea, not that there's no Olam Haba, but he's basically saying that essentially I will be leaving this world as if I'm living in Gehenna. My life is a living Gehenna. Now, again, secular Bible scholars make a whole business here about denying Olam Haba, but we consider that kfira, vada. Yaakov believed in Olam Haba, Yaakov believed in Techiyas HaMesim. There's no question here. But Sheol either means the grave or Sheol means a type of Gehenna, a type of purgatory, we would call it. Okay, all right, thank you, and be well, take care.